The lecture series is one of 5 programs that's run through the Center for Responsible Citizenship. And what we strive to do with this series is to provide public lectures on a variety of topics that are of interest to members of all different faiths, addressing issues relevant to faith in today's world. We're able to provide these lectures free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors, and I'd particularly like to welcome the donors who were joining us at the reception and who have come this evening. So thank you very much. Tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by the Scarboro Mission, and we welcome Mike Traer. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for making tonight's lecture possible. Like the Scarboro Missions, many of you here tonight invest in some aspect of St. Jerome's mission. We rely on our partnership with you to be able to provide our students and our community with the best in liberal arts Catholic education. As a federated university, we do not receive any government funding for capital enhancements, so we do rely solely on support from donors for our infrastructure. So thank you for those of you who've invested in that part of our mission. Now, while the government, of course, does support what we do within those walls, of course, it doesn't allow us to grow in areas that are particularly of importance due to our Catholic heritage. We rely on donors to help support such things as our campus ministry program, our unique social justice and outreach initiatives, and our commitment to sustainability. Thank you for all that you do in helping to make SJU a place where students feel valued for who they are, not just for what they can do. So without any further ado, and to get on with tonight's lecture, which will be way more exciting than I could ever be, I'd like to introduce our President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. David Perrin.
Thanks so very much, Nadine, and it truly is a pleasure to welcome you, all of you, here tonight and to share in this final lecture of our series this year, especially, as Nadine has said, to our donors that have come over from our reception and to partake in the reflection this evening. In a very special way, it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce our guest lecturer tonight. Now, as you know, most often I'm the individual at the end of the night that kind of picks up the thank you and sort of closes off the evening. But because Dr. Heather Eaton and I have a very special relationship that goes back to my former university, Nadine very graciously invited me to make these words of introduction tonight. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome you, Dr. Eaton, and to this lecture series here at St. Jerome's University. This evening's lecture is a partnership with Scarboro Missions Lecture, and we're very pleased to welcome our guests this evening, Father Mike, who is here with us as a partnership, and so welcome to you as well. As I've mentioned, I have known Heather for many years from my time at St. Paul University in Ottawa, and can say how honored we are to have her here today and how very much we are looking forward to her lecture. Today, Dr. Eaton and I are good friends and colleagues, so I'm mentioning today we are. Is that great when I can put a zinger out like that? Now what's coming next, right? However, it wasn't always so. We started out as academic rivals. Back in 1994-95, Dr. Eaton and I both applied for the same job at St. Paul University in Christian Spirituality and Ethics. I got the job. We started out as rivals. However, within a year, the hiring committee discovered they had made a grave mistake. And they opened up another tenure-track faculty position and hired Dr. Eaton to make it right. I like to think that St. Paul University got the both and the best of the worlds. Having rectified their earlier mistake, Dr. Eaton and I worked closely together at St. Paul University and enjoyed many conversation and collegial moments up to this day. When I left St. Paul University, Heather generously opened up her home and hosted a farewell reception sponsored by the faculty. And I remember that hospitality and that kindness, and I believe your cat to this day. Heather's accomplishments are many, including her book, Introducing Ecofeminist Theologies, as well as a wide range of publications, including edited books and editor-refereed journals, chapters in books, papers and refereed journals, and conference proceedings, major invited academic contributions, technical reports. You see, I'm telling you, they really rectified their mistake. You couldn't say that about me. Technical reports, academic papers, presentations, and other publications with editorial boards, selected workshops, consultations, public presentations, selected book reviews, and media presentations. Whew, did I miss out on anything? See, she's just a little embarrassed, and that's a big accomplishment. Heather's background in ecology, feminism, and theology is enhanced by her commitment to finding a new vision for social, ecological justice and sustainable future through dynamic spirituality. Her interests are global, with recent focus on evolution, earth dynamics, and religious imagination. This evening, Dr. Eaton will be speaking on One Earth, Many Religions, the spiritual quest for a sustainable and just future, a topic with which she is extensively familiar and eminently qualified to expand upon for us. Ladies and gentlemen, please assist me in welcoming Dr. Heather Eaton.
Yes, it took me a couple of years to forgive Dr. Perrin for getting that job, but I did get over it. So welcome this evening. Thank you very much to St. Jerome's, to David Perrin, to Scarboro Missions, to all of you for coming. And tonight, we're just going to explore some of these topics. I need my clicker. Got the clicker. One Earth, Many Religions, a spiritual quest for a sustainable and just future. Now, when Dr. Perrin and I were working on how to frame this topic, this is probably what you've read. This is what we're going to discuss. And just to say, when I reread this as I was preparing for the talk, I thought it's just a little bit ambitious to do in one evening. So I was a little bit overwhelmed myself with the paragraph that we had settled upon, but I'm going to do my best to go over some parameters of this. Where there is a vision, no vision, the people perish. That's a very profound statement. What does it mean to say that when there isn't a vision, people perish? So to begin this evening's reflection, it's on what do we mean by vision? Is it, as Teilhard de Chardin would say, to see? So you need a vision to see. But it's also to know. We also need it to understand. Visions are reference points. They give us direction. And they also give us goals. So many of us have lived through the 20th century. And the 20th century was an era of massive change. And these are just some of the changes. We now speak of a global community. The world is interconnected in radically new ways that have never existed before. They're interconnected in economies, but they're also interconnected in terms of culture. They're also exchanges in terms of religion, languages, values. If any of you have any children and grandchildren, you know they live in a world of media. It's a very quick, media-savvy world that is completely different than my world, and I'm assuming than your world. They live in a very different world of understanding. The 20th century saw the rise of ecological problems that have never existed before on the planet or to this degree. And ecological problems, as we know, do not respect political boundaries. So that's a very difficult problem to solve when we use national boundaries and national orientations to solve problems that don't exist in nation states or they exist beyond them. It's a new world in terms of war and peace. The 20th century saw 2 world wars, but then since then, endless conflicts. So we now don't talk about wars so much, we talk about conflicts. And conflicts are in a very different form now. It's not with soldiers or standing armies, it's with private security services. And the casualties are 90% civilians, most of whom are women and children. That's a completely new face of conflict. We have a language of human rights that also developed in the 20th century. And if we have human rights, they're for everyone. We have a much greater awareness of the multiplicity of religions, both historically and in the present. And for those of us who have a relationship with the religious traditions, we're now confronted with many traditions. And religions are very slow to respond, and this is a very major challenge. And then those of us of our generation, but particularly younger generations, are confronted with what to do. What are they going to do with their lives? How are they going to make sense of the world? What vision are they going to have to respond? And what are they going to do? We live in a world with massive poverty. We live in also a world where sexuality has been stretched to great elasticities, where people are of multiple different kinds of orientations that certainly wouldn't have existed in my mother's generation. We also live in a world that is being structured. It's being structured in a new way. So capitalism is clearly structuring the world, and economic interpretations of the world are very predominant. Economic integrations. But the problem is that as economies integrate, we get inequities structured in economic form, not so much in ideological or social-political forms. We get inequities structured in economic forms. We have corporate ownership. We have corporate ownership that it's international in scope, and it's international in legislation, so it's very difficult to handle. We throw around the term globalization, but globalization is many things. It's integrated economies, but it's also cultural systems are being globalized and very much affected by Western views of the world, Western ideologies. Globalization is also encouraging that whenever we think about the world, economic terms trump everything else. So economics is the bottom line, but it's the top line, and it's often the only line. Governments now, if we were to ask ourselves, what is the role of democratic governments in much of the world? And it's, for the most part, protecting economic interests. So in my view, although this is a very general statement, I don't think governments are acting in the benefit of the people, they're acting in the benefit of the economy. And we have Prime Minister Harper now working on his second trip to China. We have land grabs happening all over the world. This is the term that's used where we have countries, China is one of the countries, but Russia is another country, that are very aware that in the very near future there's going to be massive food shortages. So China is buying up huge tracts of land. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of acres in Africa, but also in northern Quebec, because they know that these are places where food is going to be grown. So they know that food is going to be the commodity of the future. So they're calling these land grabs. We have privatization in the world. So what is being privatized? Social services, healthcare, food, drugs, security forces, prisons. These are all being privatized. These have all been public services that are now private services. And we also have phenomenal movements like the Arab Spring or the Occupy movement, which is a new face of social change, and I would call them young activists and the formation of a new left. And I'll talk more about that later. But something is changing there. So these are some of the structures. So there have been global changes and there have been global structural changes. So this topic, One Earth, Many Religions, the Spiritual Quest for a Sustainable and Just Future, is in 3 parts. I don't know if you're aware, but I get to talk for about 50 minutes, so please try not to go to sleep. And if you go to sleep, please try not to snore overly loudly. Oops, I don't know where to put my watch. Okay, oops, okay. Part 1, Many Religions. You know, some of us have worked in religion, some of us in this room, I know many of you, or some of you, and you've worked in the area of religion, or you've been committed to the Christian or Catholic tradition. And we have spent a great deal of time working from within particular traditions. But when we take a step back and say, what is religion? Well, that's a much more difficult question to answer. What is religion? So we know that religions are beliefs and faiths and institutions, that they have texts and they have systems of authority, that they have dogmas and customs, they have communities and they have rituals. So we can observe that all these dimensions exist in religion. But religions are also multifaceted in how we engage with them. So they are stories we live by. Their symbols, their visions, their meanings, their beliefs, their intellectual frameworks. And religions also provide larger parameters, or what we call worldviews, or what Charles Taylor calls social imaginaries. They talk about our origins and our destinies. They give us the parameters to reality. They give us beliefs about reality that we need to negotiate and wrestle with. They give us a language for what is holy, for what is sacred. And religion is also replete with assumptions. Is the world good? Is the world not good? What ethics do we need to live by? What are human and earth relationships? How are they supposed to be structured? What do we do with suffering? What is our final destiny? So these are, in the 20th century, when religions were bumping up against other religions, we saw that while they all hold all these structures, they don't have the same assumptions. Sorry, just checking I'm on the right slide. So what we've seen, as religions have bumped against each other, what we've seen in this reshaping of the global order of the 20th century is that religions themselves are being immensely challenged. And these are some of the challenges. We have many religions, but we have very poor theories about what the nature of religion is. And the people who are least aware of theories of religion are the believers. This is classically the split between theology and religious studies. So people who began recognizing that there's a world of religions, not just world religions, but there are histories and histories of religions that have come, flourished, gone, become extinct, and more have emerged, that we need to have theories of religion. Well, this is not touching theology very closely still. Religions are very challenged by epistemology, so we have seen a massive critique of what do we know, how do we know it, how do we make claims, how do we understand our certitudes. And religious claims par excellence are some of the most difficult to explain. Is it belief? Is it faith versus reason? Is it truth claims? Is it revelation? Revelation from outside of time, inside of time? How do we deal with religion and science? This is a whole realm of what we call epistemological challenges. And religions are under the gun, so to speak, to be clear about their claims. And I would say especially Christianity in Western countries. So there has been an enormous challenge to the intellectual side of religious claims. The complexity of the world is a challenge to religions. How are religions, who for the most part have developed in isolation and for the most part have been protective of their own traditions, now existing in multiple forms of exchanges? How do they navigate this complexity of the world? The ecological crisis is a huge challenge to religions. Are religions supposed to respond? Do they respond? Is it just ethics? Is the ecological challenge, does that have anything to do with religion or everything to do with religion? And religions all respond differently to this question. Sciences are another massive challenge to religions. What do we do with evolution and cosmology when we understand our religions to have some kind of truth about time and space, and yet sciences are claiming truth about time and space, and it's not the same truth? If any of you have followed the realm of what we call contextual or post-colonial movements, how far can a particular group decide that their truths are going to be? How much authority can each context have? What do we do with post-colonial epistemologies, we call them? How far can they go? And then we have justice issues. Religions have been extraordinarily challenged by justice issues, by their complicity in gender, ethnic, race, class, sexual identities. Are religions liberatory? Are they oppressive? Are they both? And usually they're a mixture. Each tradition is a mixture. So there have been huge challenges to religion because of the current global situation. The monotheistic traditions, and I'm going to speak predominantly from the Christian tradition, they have particular problems and challenges that I want to mention. And one is, the first is the beliefs and the certitudes. When we talk about revelation in the Christian tradition, what are we talking about? How do we know that we are speaking from any kind of truth? How are we going to assess the beliefs and the claims? For example, the Trinity, the resurrection, the afterlife. How are we going to assess what any of these mean? Are we just going to reinterpret them in each era, find a new vision for them in each era, or what do they actually mean? What are they based on? We certainly know, particularly those of us who work in gender issues, and I know there are some in the room who do, that the Christian tradition has been quite complicit in the history of the oppression of women, and it's only until relatively recently that it's begun to address them, and I would say moderately successful. So the Christian tradition has embedded itself in slavery. In South Africa, the Christian tradition was partially responsible for apartheid, the Dutch Christian Reformed tradition. So the Christian tradition does not have a clean history when it comes to social dominations. Then we have internal corruptions and ethical inconsistencies within the tradition. And I don't think we need to say a lot about that, but the Catholic tradition is, it's there. Within the Christian tradition as a whole, we've seen a long history of depreciation of the natural world. So as the Christian tradition developed, it became very much a human-centered tradition. We call anthropocentrism. So the natural world was not considered a place of divine revelation. It was not considered part of the drama of salvation. It was either the background to the drama of salvation, or it was irrelevant altogether. So the natural world dropped from what we call the religious horizon. The natural world dropped from the religious imagination. And so we arrive at the beginning of the 21st century in an ecological crisis, and we don't know how to pair that up with the Christian tradition without a great deal of work. And again, I know some of you are doing this work. And then we have other worldly spiritualities. Now when I say that, do you know what I mean? Spiritualities that are focused on another world, the next world. That at their worst form, they would say that our origins, neither the human origins nor our destiny are related to this earth or on this planet. But most Christians set their sights on another plane of existence after death. And many of us have found that this inhibits our ability to deal with the actual issues on this planet now. So these are some of the problems and challenges within the tradition. So in a general way, I and many others who work in this field would say religions are overall, in their current form, ill-equipped to deal with the challenges of the world today. They're ill-equipped. They don't know how to manage the global world structures. They don't know how to deal with the complexity. The traditions, the current religious traditions, they take place at a personal level or at a local community level. But to tackle some of these larger issues with a vision that's got some kind of traction is very difficult. Or they're part of the problem. So those of us who work in gender would say the patriarchal elements that are still strong in the tradition are a problem for gender. I know that many of you in this room have worked on social issues, and I look at the Scarboro missions or development and peace or work at St. Jerome's on justice issues. These are absolutely critical, but these remain still a minority stream in the Christian tradition. So most of the Christian tradition is not looking at social issues. Even less is looking at ecological issues. Even less is looking at democracy. So when the religious tradition is part of the problem, then it's even harder to figure out how are we going to move. I would say religions themselves are in transition. Now what do I mean by that? When we look at the Catholic tradition, so just one tiny example, and we look at Scarboro missions or development and peace, or we look at Jim Prophet and the Jesuits' work on ecology, or we look at the Vatican, or we look at Catholic Feminists for Free Choice. Which one of those is the real Catholicism? What are we going to do with all this diversity? So we can see people in traditions claiming authority for their own interpretations, but that means we have vast amounts of interpretations. We watch evangelical forms of Christianity taking over many traditions, including Catholicism. So there are evangelical traditions, but evangelical religiosity is becoming popular all around the world. We look at Islam. Islam was the intellectual leader of the world in the 12th century, and Islam now has many faces, one of which is the radical jihad, but the intellectual tradition is all but, it's reduced in its public presence. It's still there, but it's reduced in its public presence. We have Judaism, except Judaism isn't Judaism, it's Judaisms. It's all forms of Judaism. We have Buddhism. Buddhism also has many faces. For example, we have the Dalai Lama, the leader of Tibet, leader of Tibetan Buddhism, who writes books, but he writes for Western Christians. So most of the Dalai Lama's writings are not for a Buddhist group at all. They're for Western Christians who don't have a spirituality that's got any depth. So what does this mean? So this is what I mean by religions are in transition. So I'm going to assume that you've all read this quote by now at the bottom. Would that be fair? So this is Rabbi Shatter. So what do we do when the religions that we understand, what we connect to this term, are themselves, are they actually ossified remnants? Are they being challenged by many directions? Are their reality maps obsolete? So I'm going to leave those as questions, but I'm going to give you two more quotes to ponder. So I'll read these. The first one. Religion, as we know it, is over. Religions in their current form cannot respond to this level of crisis, but we cannot respond without them. So that's Thomas Berry, someone with whom I spent a great deal of time studying. Do many of you know who Thomas Berry is? Yes? Okie dokie. So that is a very, very compelling phrase. What does that mean? Religions in their current form, meaning those that have arisen up with the great civilizations, or what we call the axial age, they can't respond, but we can't respond without them. Then we have Einstein's provocative and profound phrase, problems cannot be solved at the level of consciousness in which they were created. We shall require a substantially new manner of thinking if humankind is to survive. So when I just want to say that I have no idea what's going to happen with religions. I don't know what should or could happen. And I also know it depends on which end of the stick we're picking up. If we talk about religious communities, I'm sure they will survive because their forms are flexible. When we talk about religion in academia, it's very hard to say because there's so many different voices and different strands and intellectual currents when we're studying religion. We know that religion it unifies, it's diverse, it can be a player in peace, it can be a player in conflict. Many of us, I'm sure, are familiar with being spiritual but not religious. Very popular. There's actually a new book out last week called The Wisdom of Religion. So someone wants to extract the wisdom from the religion. So they don't want the religion, they want the wisdom. In the same way, we want the spirituality, but not the religion. Which usually means we don't want the dogma and the institution. We don't want all of the wrappings. We want the depth. But it often comes that we don't want the ethics or the responsibility that comes with it too. So it's got a double-edged sword. I would say myself that I can never see spirituality being absent from the human community because, in my view, human is a spiritual animal. The spirituality is a dimension of us. It doesn't belong to the religions. Religions are a voice of that spirituality. Sometimes well, sometimes poorly, sometimes dreadfully. But that humans are spiritual by orientation and by nature, to me, would be a fairly reasonable claim. And that there's something in us that compels us to look for the parameters of reality. There's something in us that draws us to ask deeper questions beyond our own daily experience, that draws us to think about reality under larger horizons. To me, that's a spiritual impulse. There is something of the mystery of existence that calls us or lures us, attracts us. I would put all of that under the rubric of spirituality. And I would say that we have realms of experiences where we end up articulating a language of the sacred because there is no other language that's adequate. And I think all of those come with being human. But from the point of view of religions, there are more religions that have come into the human community and gone extinct than the ones that exist now. So religions, in my spirituality is primary and religions are a secondary expression. But that's very debatable, and I don't know what's going to happen. So I just put this up to say, I don't really know what's going to happen, but I do see major changes in the world in terms of the religious landscape. So part 2 of my challenge for this evening of what is the quest for a sustainable and just future. So when I use the word sustainability, it includes peace, ecological security and integrity, and justice includes both social and ecological justice. So we talk about peace, or we don't talk about peace, but we live amidst war and conflict. So the top left, most of the casualties of the wars, 90% of the casualties are civilians, women and children, of all the conflicts that are taking place in the world. On the right-hand side, we have the military. The military is, from a peace point of view, simply legitimized violence. It's a hyper-masculine culture. It orders the world in terms of enemies, the good and the bad, and it legitimizes its presence and its violent action. We have the cost of war on the bottom left. And this girl's going to live like this for her whole life. And then we entertain ourselves with war games, conflict. We entertain ourselves with violence all the time. So if we think, so I teach university, so sometimes I ask my class, how many television shows or movies have you seen this week alone that have been on the death or murder of someone, the sexual assault of a young girl? How many? And so they'll say 2 or 3 or 3 or 4, whatever, because it's all over the television all the time. And then I'll say, what's that diet for your imagination? So it's not entertainment, it's educating your imagination on violence. So we live in a diet of violence. How many of you are familiar with the Hunger Games that are coming out? How many of you, your kids or your grandkids are going to see the Hunger Games? Have any of you read the books? They are hyper-violent. There is just no other way to describe those. I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I read the books, and I ended up going to the head of chapters in Ottawa to say, I can't believe you're selling these books. Anyway, I didn't win that one, as you can see. So, what does peace mean? So in my world, we do not spend enough time talking about peace. I don't know what we think peace is, but peace is not the absence of violence. Peace is a very active way of living. Now, I put the top one up, conflict is inevitable, war is a choice, because if you were to go to the War Museum in Ottawa, if any of you visited it, when you walk in, one of the first plaques you see is war is inevitable. This is very startling for someone like me, comes from the peace world, who studied and learned from Ursula Franklin, and she would say, no, conflict is inevitable, war is a choice. That's a completely different worldview. So she would say the very first step to peace is you have to decide violence is not an option. You can't weigh it. You have to decide it. It's not an option. This is what Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Dalai Lama, these are what people, John Paul Lederach, violence is not an option. And some of these people were in intense violence, and some of these people lost their lives. But the decision was violence is not an option. And then you have to learn about peace. So peace requires certain situations. It requires social stability. It requires that it requires an understanding that oppression breeds conflict. So if you're going to have situations of oppression, you are not going to have peace. So violence erupts and conflicts erupt out of oppression. They erupt out of economic deprivation. They erupt out of ecological stress. They erupt out of exclusion. So when we're going to talk about peace, we're immediately into sustainability and social justice. There is no other way. Peace requires this. But peace also requires that we train. We have to train for peace. Peace is, if you want to train for nonviolent resistance, it's not passivity, it's active training for nonviolent resistance. And I'm happy to see that there are more and more peace universities around the world that are training people. But we have, if you were to compare how much training for peace we have versus how much training for war, seriously, and economic resources for war versus economic resources for peace. If we talk about teaching peace, so if you start paying attention to how does the media frame issues, it often always frames issues in terms of conflicts. It doesn't frame issues to show that humans are actually naturally cooperative. We are not actually naturally competitive. We are naturally cooperative. But that's not how the media would present human issues. So the media hypes up the idea that there's always a good and a bad, a pro and a con, a for and against. And that's just a framing. That's just a vision, just an interpretation. So we need to teach peace. And we need to practice peace. And when I talk about practice peace, I'm very struck by two dimensions. I've been teaching nonviolent spirituality this semester, and I'm very, very struck by even the strongest social activists, so Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King, they spent an enormous amount of time, what they said, cultivating interiority. So become a depth inner awareness about jealousy, anger, depression, cruelty. These are in all of us. It's not that there are peaceful people and they're violent people. It's that some are, you give license to cruelty, you give license to violence, or you train for peace. So I would say that's something that is absolutely critical in the world, how to learn to listen without judging. I'm hopeless at this, so I'm working on that. How do we learn to build bridges? How do we learn to understand conflicts? Conflicts are very difficult to understand, and we have so many preconceived ideas around so many conflicts. So it's a very big step to move towards peace. I don't see another road forward for a just and sustainable future that has any possibility if we don't embrace peace very radically. So when we bring in ecological issues to this justice and sustainability, I mean, the picture's not good, right? But you probably all know this. So this is the oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. This is from coal. This is a sludge that leaked from a coal plant. This one on the bottom is in the Sudan. Now this is very interesting because there's a shortage of cattle. So I don't know if the news of the Sudan is not very much, the Western media is not very interested in the news of Sudan because it's such a poverty-stricken country, and as Stephen Lewis says, who cares about Africa? But there were 1,000 people killed in the fall over the stealing cattle because they need cattle. So the ecological stress, the relationship between ecological stress and social violence is very high in some parts of the world, and that's just one example. So they're arming themselves to protect their cattle. So this relationship between ecological issues, peace, and sustainability is also acute. Now, I have a whole lot of information in the next 10-15 minutes that's not uplifting, so cultivate interiority here. I also think that we do not pay nearly as much attention as we need to the suffering of animals with our ecological ruin, because animals are suffering profoundly. Okay, so this is the topic: ecological issues, peace and sustainability. So what are the major ecological issues? So I'm going to talk about two levels of major ecological issues. The first is planetary. Now these ones are systemic, meaning they're planetary issues. Climate instability. If any of you followed the work on climate change, it used to be called global warming. So the joke is that they'd go to these meetings, they'd talk about global warming, and all the Canadians would say, yes, we want global warming. So they changed the language to climate change, but in fact it's actually climate instability. That's what is actually happening is, excuse me, I need some water. Yes, it is here. So while everyone's having a lovely time in the warmth in the past few days, it's wreaking havoc with the plants. So climate instability, ocean stratification. So people know that the oceans have currents that flow on the surface of the oceans around the world, but they also have currents that flow vertically. So the oxygen is taken to the bottom of the ocean, the warm water is taken to the bottom, and this is a current. But if the oceans become too warm, they stratify. The water's too warm, the oxygen stays too high, and they don't have currents. So they talk about ocean stratification as because the oceans are actually what's absorbing the CO2 in the climate. So climate change, the warming of the climate is actually much faster than it has been measured because the oceans have accelerated their absorptions of CO2. So ocean stratification is now a much bigger tipping point than the hurricanes and the tornadoes and the other things that are being measured. Freshwater loss. So 2% of the water on the planet, less than 2%, is fresh water, and it has been in a closed circuit, but due to aqua mining and all kinds of pollution, there's a huge reduction now of fresh water. This is why countries are trying to buy icebergs, or at least tow icebergs. Species extinction. So we are now entering what's called the 6th Great Extinction. There have been 5 previous extinction periods on the planet. The last one was 65 million years ago when what is assumed to be a comet hit the Yucatan Basin in Mexico, which was the ending of the era of the reptiles / dinosaurs. And that was the last major extinction, but we are now in a same extinction. Now, I've been working on ecological issues for over 20 years, and 20 years ago, the UN said there were 10,000 species going extinct a year, and now the UN says 60,000 species going extinct a year. So this is colossal. Soil erosion. Soil erosion looks like a small issue, but if you think that it takes the Earth 300 years to make 1 inch of topsoil that's fertile enough to grow food, and that all of the food that we eat requires soil and topsoil, that's a planetary issue. We don't talk enough about pollution and toxicities because now it's in the air and the water and the soil, and the air and the water are movable systems, right? What goes into the air goes into the water, what goes into the water goes into the soil, and it goes into the plants, into every cell in the plants. So pollution is very, very significant. One of the most depressing news that I've heard in the past few years, I was at a conference of somebody was talking about endocrine disruptors and DNA changes caused from ecological ruin. So as chemicals interact with DNA, DNA is becoming fragmented. This is true in amphibians and frogs, but it's also becoming true in mammals and in humans. So if we're ending up disrupting DNA, you can see how serious we're getting. Biomass reduction, this is mainly the cutting of the rainforest. And then there is a whole group of thinkers who talk about the engines of evolution, that what we are doing on the planet is not just ending an era, so it's not just the ending of the Cenozoic era, which is the past 65 million years. It's actually disrupting the possibilities of evolution regenerating itself. So these are topics that are in the planetary ecological concerns that are demanding some attention. Now, the 3 issues that are addressed most are climate change, food insecurities, and water. Virtually 100% of the time, the topic is about the impact on humans. So, climate change, it's about the island states and the coastal regions for the most part. Food, we talk about food security, but it's really food insecurities, but it's at all these levels. Crop failures due to climate change, soil erosion, global markets, transportation, access, ownership, copyrights, intellectual property rights of food, it's huge. And then water, and I'm going to talk about more about water. I'm going to address two of these, climate change and water, and then energy. How are we doing? Good? Depressed yet? I'm not trying to depress you, but you know, one of the biblical phrases that I really like is that the truth shall set you free. But we do tend to not want the truth some of the time. Is it T.S. Eliot who says humans can't bear much reality? I think it is. T.S. Eliot has a poem, Humans Can't Bear Much Reality. Okay, so a little bit of reality. Climate change. If any of you have been paying attention, which I'm going to assume you have, you've noticed that in the past couple of decades, the temperatures are fluctuating. It's not as regular. We're noticing changes in water levels. We're noticing floods and droughts and tornadoes and hurricanes. That's climate instability. Coastal and island flooding is already beginning. Fresh water, the issue with fresh water is salination and pollution. And the issue with oceans is stratification, salination, and acidification. Now, when the oceans become acidified, you have to realize that that affects all of the organisms. And life is a chain, an interconnected set of beings. And if it's not necessarily alive, you have to think that whatever is in the water in the soil goes up at the trunk of the tree, into the leaves of the tree, is evaporated into the air, falls back into a lake, and then you drink it. So the idea that toxins can be contained anywhere is a completely false vision of how ecosystems work. And water is becoming, if you know about climate change tipping points, they talk about tipping points in terms of weather patterns, but now tipping points are being measured more in terms of water, especially ocean stratification and salination, acidification. Then we have so many disruptions of ecosystems and biosystems. So every time we put a road in, every time we divert water, every time we try to drain an aquifer, when we cut down a forest, we are actually not cutting down a bunch of trees. We are damaging an entire community of life, in addition to something that isn't a living ecosystem. So our knowledge of how the planet and the natural systems work is quite limited. So we have a very reductionist view of an interconnected system. So climate change is affecting all of this, and it's affecting food issues. So sources, supplies, transportation, accessibility. So there are countries planning for this. There are all kinds of countries looking at food securities and climate change. Fewer are looking at equity issues, so it's very clear that there are inequities and inequity systems around the world. So we have systemic poverty. We used to call it north-south affluence and poverty, but that doesn't work anymore because we have affluence in every part of the world and we have poverty. But of course there's a great deal more poverty, and poverty is what is growing, and affluence is becoming protected. And that will only increase with climate change. There are many people, including the UN, who say the more severe climate change becomes, the more problems there'll be for gender, because women, the UN, even in I think it's 1996, but it might have been 1994, they said women bear the brunt of ecological stress. They carry the burden more, and it's deeper and quicker, and the reason is because of the sexual division of labor that is ordering the world. So when there's ecological ruin, women who are responsible for, we say, food, fuel, and fodder, their day-to-day life is very, very stressed. And now in the world there are far more environmental refugees than there are political refugees. This is now a formal category of refugee status. So when we look at climate change, it's very, very linked to sustainability, to justice. And when we think of how are we going to speak of one one earth, many religions, and any kind of just and sustainable future without looking at some of these issues. Now we're going to look at water. So, at the level of water sources, what we've seen in the past 20 years is there's a loss of water sources, so a reduction in the amount of freshwater sources. But the biggest conflict is around ownership. Who owns water? Access, quality, costs, who's going to pay? So we've seen companies, huge bottled water companies, actually trying to buy the land that where the source of the water is. We've seen this all over the world. And we've seen them, they often come into a country, as they did in Canada, in St. John's in New Brunswick and in Hamilton. They come in by trying to own the sewage system, and because municipalities are trying to offload some of their costs, they come in trying to help a municipality deal with water issues. But then as soon as this has happened in so many parts of the world, they've come in, then they take over the water supply, and then they take over the water quality, and then they up the price. And in some places like South Africa, there are two different prices. You pay more for clean water. So then you can see where water becomes connected to poverty, and sickness becomes connected to poverty, and wealth becomes connected to clean water. Water diversion is still an issue. We're diverting far too many natural sources and directions of water, as if you just have to change this river, but it's an interconnected web. So both for agriculture and electricity, water diversion is a problem. Pollution. Again, it's the toxicity, the quantity, the quality, the kind, the source, and the fact that pollution does not respect national boundaries. So there was an experiment done in Mexico. They knew there were pollutants that were released in a certain area of a lake, and they put radioactive tracers on some of these chemicals, what were found in the breast milk of women in Nunavut. So water travels, it travels. National boundaries are not going to protect us from water issues. Then there's a big conversation that's been taking place on what is water. Is water a human right? Is it a commodity? Is it something that can be owned? Does it have intrinsic value? And who's going to decide what water is? And there is a very, very big push to not have water considered to be a human right, because if it's a human right, then it can't be commodified. And Canada voted against water being considered a human right because it wants to sell water. So this vote will come back to the UN, but it's very, very difficult because you can see once water's commodified, then there's a price. Once it's a human right, then it's not. So it has what water is understood to be is going to have economic consequences. The privatization of water, big problem. Bottled water, big problem. Have you heard of Tony Clark, Maud Barlow, and their book Blue Gold, which they won the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize for? They do some of the best work in the world on water issues, the two Canadians, Maud Barlow and Tony Clark. Aquamining. Aquamining is not done very much in Canada, although it is done in some places in Quebec. But in India, there are areas where all these underground lakes are now dry because they've been mining the water that's under, it's the lakes that are under the water tables, they're these aquifers. We almost never in the conversations of water consider plants and animals and insects and birds and what do they need in terms of quality and quantity and access of water, and do they have the right to livelihood and habitat. I mean, this conversation sounds so Mickey Mouse, but that has so much to do with the idea that we've considered ourselves the supreme species on the planet. Of course, we would never be here without the other species, well, at least without many of them. So we need to have conversations about water and other life forms. Very few people have studied how the earth purifies water. John Todd is one who has done his living machines. There used to be one in Guelph, actually, at a school in Guelph, the living machines. He studied in depth, how does the earth purify water? Because it does. And so can we model the earth's purification systems? And then the planetary diminishment of fresh water. So these are some of the issues around water. This is a lake in China. Sorry, this was a lake. 2/3 of the water of this lake have evaporated. It's gone. This is the biggest lake in China. This was in the Guardian Weekly in February. It's a very stark image. So the Guardian, if any of you read the Guardian Weekly that comes out of England, they cover a lot of environmental issues. It's one of the few newspapers that actually takes an interest in environmental issues. Energy. So the energy companies are holding summits all the time about energy. But the rest of us, in my experience, don't pay nearly as much attention as we need to about energy issues. So we use a lot of energy. Canadians in particular use more energy per capita than any other human on the planet. But really, when we talk about energy, what are the sources, the means of production, the control, the access, the prices, the availability? These are all conversations that have to do with a just and sustainable future. How are we going to have energy that is sustainable and just? I can guarantee you that I did a study about a month ago of countries that are militarizing around energy. And I was staggered to see how many military think tanks there are, including in Canada, who are projecting in the next 10, 20 years of how they're going to protect and procure energy sources. So I don't know what you think, but I think all of this conflict and war in the Middle East, as a good percentage of that has to do with energy. And this is just one face of energy. But there are security, if you just Google security and energy, you will be absolutely astounded how many countries have very sophisticated think tanks in place and economic resources in place to deal with energy. So security systems, but energy and trade, and whose responsibility is it, and where is the public on the conversation on energy? Now the problem is that the governments and corporate partnerships are the form. So did many of you follow the Keystone Pipeline fiasco and now the Northern Gateway fiasco? And it doesn't matter, it doesn't seem to matter how much we protest and how well or poorly we do it, these pipelines are going through. So that says something about democracy, that says something about citizenship, that says something about, this lecture is in a series on corporate citizenship. Yes? Social, is that what it's called? Corporate citizenship? Responsible citizenship. That was a Freudian slip. So what about responsible citizenship and energy? How are we going to be part of the conversation? Just so you know, I was looking up some of the ecological cost of windmills. So I don't have the windmills up there as they're the clean, pure one and everything else is dirty, because they also have their difficult side. But the cost of energy, it's really quite colossal. The sovereignty issues, how many military invasions are going on currently and about energy? How much social stress is there? If any of you followed the fracking, people know what's going on in terms of fracking, that's another energy source. Huge social stress, ecological costs, health costs. It's almost impossible to have a national conversation on fracking. So these things happen before we have any kind of resistance in place. And this is because the government is bonding itself to the energy industries, not to the people. I mean, that may be simple, but it does seem, I mean, Canada is certainly a spokesperson for energy, corporate energy. And then there's all the toxicities. There's toxins from coal, from oil, from gas, from wind, from hydro. There are military activities that are around energy, spills and cleanups. And, you know, a major oil spill registers as an increase of gross national product and gross domestic product. So the problem is that when you have a major oil spill, it can register as an increase in your economic, the life of the country or the province. So energy is very big. And I just wanted to show you what happens, a story in Guatemala. This is the Canadian mining company. And they wanted a certain set of land for mining, and the people wouldn't leave. So they pushed them out, and they destroyed their houses, and they came back and rebuilt them. So the second time they burned their houses. And the third time they raped 11 women. Then they killed 2 people, and now they're militarized. This is the mining companies' militarizations or security forces. So this is going to be an ordering of the world, and we need to be very conscious about it. So I only have 2 more really major disaster data. Yes. This is just a face of conflict and environmental stress. So I'm linking peace, justice, sustainability, and ecological integrity, and what's the opposite face of that. So as we move into an era of ecological stress, we're starting to see more different kinds of conflicts. So environmental stress shifts the balance of power. So if we look at the Keystone Pipeline, where's the balance of power? Well, it ended up federally. Right? It ended up in a federal, but it wasn't really a federal issue. So then we had all these international voices that came in, and they were called, what did he call them? The celebrities, I forget Harper's term, and it was almost comical. Does anybody remember? Anyway, it was a very interesting term of they need to, the radicals, the foreigners and the celebrities need to stay out of our issues. And so, I mean, it was...
That was Mr. Oliver. Mr. Oliver, not Carter.
Yes, you're right. Thank you. Either way, it shows that where's the power going to be held on any of these issues? We've looked at the control and ownership of resources, international property rights, trade agreements around water, around other issues, and this is becoming an area of conflict. There's contention over the ice-free lanes that are supposedly going to open up in the Arctic because of the melting, and who's going to have sovereignty. There are increased populations. With increased populations, there's land stress, there's environmental refugees. We've seen a drop in food production and global food supplies. Environmental stress also aggravates existing social conflicts, so class, ethnic, racial, tribal, gender. These tensions are increased with ecological stress. There are people studying how the state systems respond to ecological stress, and it's very clear that fragile states, whether they're democratic or they're royal systems or they're socialist systems, fragile states are much more susceptible to becoming militarized when there's ecological stress. And then there's a whole lot of work on environmental security and scarcity. Then there's more pressing issues. I still think that the gender issues, in terms of social issues, the colossal lack of human rights that women have all over the world it's just abominable. It's very, very difficult to get traction, although even in my lifetime there have been a great deal of gains. In the same time, we've seen the rise of slavery. So, contemporary slavery and trafficking, this is a UN statistic and many consider it quite conservative, 27 million people. The economic disparities, the 1 and the 99%, the increase of refugees. On the ecological side, species extinction, human-animal relationships, ecological illiteracy. Do you know, hardly anybody knows how to grow food. It's amazing. We don't know how to grow food. We might know how to work any kind of technological device, but we can't grow food. It's pretty staggering when we think of it that way. And what happens when there isn't beauty in the world? What happens when the natural world is not a place that enlivens our imagination, awakens us to beauty, teaches us our sensibilities about beauty? What does it mean to live in a world where there isn't that kind of beauty?
That 27 million, is that for a year or something, or what? What's that?
Total.
Only total.
In total. This is one initiative trying to respond, the Earth Charter. I would encourage all of you to take a look at the Earth Charter. It's the most negotiated document that's ever gone through human communities. It's supposed to be similar to the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. It's a very spiritually sensitive document negotiated with all kinds of people from different religious traditions, social movements, and this is just some of what it says about how are we going to go forward. I am conscious of the time, and I'm going to go quickly through a couple of things. I wanted to say there are resources within traditions in their current forms that help us, and these are some of them. And I would call these the transformation of the self. And these are parts of religious traditions we don't think about very much, but there are deep disciplines to educate the human person, to help us educate our desires, to deal with things like regret and repentance, to deal with what one of my friends calls our melancholia about the earth, to cultivate interiority, to learn how to sacrifice, to learn how to embrace simplicity. These are all parts of the ethics, the individual ethics in traditions. And then there's a whole set of resources around social transformation within many traditions, and certainly within the Christian tradition. So the impulse for liberation at a social level, the Christian tradition has worked, especially in the second half of the 20th century, on how to deal with structural sin and structural oppression, and how can this be changed. And all of the work on ecological issues has led to a field called eco-justice. Most religious traditions lean towards nonviolence, and some have many resources of how you actually train for nonviolence. Now, I was going to spend longer on this, but I really won't think I will. But I do want to say, when we look at the issues that I spoke about before, the global structures, the global issues, the planetary, the justice, climate change, water, energy, do we think religions in their current form can actually respond? We can retrieve, we can reconstruct, and we can reinterpret. But do they actually lead to responsible citizenship? And I raise the question, because to me it's not clear they do. And I wanted to say this is one of the lectures in Catholic experience. Now, I'm in Ottawa, and in Ottawa, there are many, many different pockets to the Catholic Church doing excellent work. But honestly, in Ottawa, the biggest conversation taking place in the churches is about the new missal, and whether you can stand or kneel, and whether we have enough priests, and what are we going to do with the shortage of priests, and should we work on Vatican II? And I was having a conversation with Bishop Remy DeRue a couple years ago, and I said, I think we're past Vatican III. Like, why would we go to Vatican II? I don't even understand why we would even try. But I do know there's a big move to bring back the energy of Vatican II. And in theology, which I have spent a good part of my life, the concerns are predominantly Christology, biblical hermeneutics, salvation, and occasionally ethics. So I think this is an impaired vision. You may not agree, and we may discuss it, but I think it's an impaired vision. So I'm going to say that there are... What happened to the one before that? Okay. I don't have that sheet. So what do we mean by spiritual? Spirituality is a kind, it's not information. So it's not like religious dogma. It's insights. Spiritualities train and teach consciousness. It's as close to us as breathing. It's as vital to us as breathing. Spirituality awakens wonder and humility and gratitude. These are very profound dimensions of the human being. There's a relationship between aesthetics and ethics and reverence that we need to cultivate. All the traditions talk about spiritual awakening as a movement. So, from death to life, from darkness to light, illusion to enlightenment, confusion to clarity. These are how all different traditions speak of this. It's a movement from sleep to awake. So, one way to speak about a spiritual vision is how to be present to earth on earth's terms. Now, something's happened. Did I skip something? Sorry, I'm missing. Oh yeah, okay, I'm not missing anything. I'm just going fast. Okay, I'm going to skip that one though. We're going to this one. Can I carry on for a bit, David, or what? Should I stop soon? I want to talk about two new voices. Now, this one comes from those who've worked in the Occupy movement, and I just want to explain this briefly by saying I've spent my life trying to understand vision and meaning. My mother says the first word out of my mouth was why. So I spent 7 years in L'Arche with John Vanier, trying to understand suffering. And then I studied theology, and I went to Latin America to study liberation theology and that kind of vision. And then I studied with Thomas Berry to understand his cosmological vision. I studied with feminists to understand gender. So I spent a lot of time trying to understand meaning and vision. And I had 2 doctoral students come to my class this week to talk about the Occupy movement. And they were excellent, and they were giving all this intellectual analysis. And I finally said, so what's the vision? And he says, oh, well, we don't use that word. I said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, that's just a fascist term, vision. Then I said, okay, well, what's the meaning? He said, these are fascist constructions of the 20th century. We don't use that word. We use goals. So then they sat down with me for 2 hours to educate me on what does this mean about what is our desire for meaning and our desire for foundations, and how that is a product of a certain kind of thinking. And I can guarantee you they are not in this world, in this world of meaning. This is not how they construct reality at all. So they educated me on rhizomes. And this is part of this postmodern thought, but it's very interesting. So this is one of the insights into a spirituality for a just and sustainable future. So they don't want to talk about a tree. They want to talk about sets of relationships. So they say that, well, this is what they say, one of the things they say. What's important is it's non-hierarchical. It's non-linear. It's not necessarily logical. There's many entry points. There's many forms of interconnections. That is the image of the Occupy movement. That's the image of the Arab Spring. And that is the way the younger generation of intellectuals are thinking about changing the world. It's very, very different than anything I have ever learned. And I found it very challenging and extremely interesting. And these are some of the values of the rhizomes, as they throw around as if that's a word they use every day, which they do, but I have to learn. Very much opposed to foundationalist thinking. So they don't talk about visions, they don't talk about meaning, they talk about goals. They talk about interconnections. If any of you watched or went to any of the Occupy sites, whatever someone said was repeated all the way back so that everyone heard. They had equity. Anyone could take the mic. It was very, very different forms of social organization. It's not anarchy, but it's certainly not hierarchy. It's really these rhizomes. So I just thought I'd bring this to you to say this is how the next generation, this is how they are conceptualizing the world, and it's not the same. And I wanted to show you where it's happening in the world. So, Arab Spring, an impact without Wall Street, protests that started before Occupy, and then the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations. So it's very interesting. This is a new ordering of the world. Okay? And this is another vision of the world. And this is another vision of the world. These are very different visions. And this is the one I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to close. So, keep the rhizomes in your head. Second set of insights that's impacting on this quest for a spirituality, for a just and sustainable future, is the science that's been emerging in the 20th century. We live in a cosmos, 13.7 billion years of process. The Earth, 4.6 billion years of Earth dynamics. If you think it rained on the Earth for 300 million years, I mean, that's just astonishing, to form the oceans. I took a sabbatical a few years ago and I studied evolution, and the ingenuity and the creativity and the complexity of the processes of life on Earth stagger the human imagination. I studied the hydrologic cycle, how does water work? And I mean, our feats of engineering are minuscule compared to the brilliance of the Earth. We belong to the Cenozoic era, hominids, and we're not very old. We are Homo sapiens 500,000 years, and that's being generous. So this is a new voice in the human community. What does it mean to take this seriously? What does it mean to reflect from this paradigm? Well, it changes the reference points. If you want to understand humanity, and humanity is a spiritual creature, you don't first look to the religions, you look to the processes of the earth. It changes your horizon of meaning. The earth is not our context, it's our source. As Thomas Berry says, the earth is primary and the human is derivative. That there's a continuity, not a discontinuity between humans and earth. And every way we live is as if there's a discontinuity between humans and the earth. But in fact, in every way, it's a continuity between humans and the earth. And I think that awakens or arouses spirituality. It awakens wonder and reverence and humility and aesthetics and ethics and gratitude. And I think it brings forth a spiritual imperative that we need to re-enchant ourselves with the earth. So in conclusion, one earth, many peoples, many cultures, many religions. I think evolution is extremely challenging to our worldview, extremely challenging. It makes us understand that we have emerged from this process, which means whatever we call a spiritual sensibility is also part of the process of the earth, which means we live in a divine milieu, as says Teilhard de Chardin. When we study the natural world, we understand how embedded in it we are. When we understand, if we pay attention to the lives of animals, we understand that they are our kin. So all of our teachings that we are separate from, unique, different, superior to, I think they all need to be challenged. And when we ask, how much do we know? Well, what's very interesting is that in the 20th century, we know that Copernicus and Galileo got in trouble because they said, it's not a geocentric universe, it's a heliocentric universe. So they said it's not the Earth that's the center, it's the sun. Well, we know that's all wrong too. And not only are we part of a solar system that's part of the Milky Way galaxy, there are 170 billion galaxies. So in my view, there's no possible way that our religious tradition is the reference point for all that reality. That reality is the reference point for us. So, this is from Rachel Carson. The less taste we shall have for destruction. So I'm suggesting we need a different reference point for who we are. That's a very bad picture of the Earth from the moon. And that there's energy available in the universe in all kinds of forms. And this is actually two galaxies colliding from the Hubble telescope. And that's the change of perspective. Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes for questions if you'd like. Yes? Questions, comments, additions? Yes.
I've often wondered what it would be like to stand up here, and I am now. I spent about 2 weeks this summer in the Arctic, and while I was there, I was exposed to a National Film Board presentation of a series of videos on the Inuits' animism and its spiritual belief. One of the videos was called The Diet of Souls, and it was their view of the Inuits' view of how can I eat something that I believe has a spirit, the animals having spirit. And when the Christians came in to convert a lot of the Inuits, particularly the Baffin area and up, Their belief system obviously wasn't the same, that the humans had the spirit, the animals didn't. And I found it very opening. Oh, yeah, it was an interesting...
Very good, thank
and
you.
it goes along with
Yes.
a lot of what you're talking about.
Good comment, thank you. Other comments?
I just wondered if you're aware of what the Conservative government in Ontario, in Ottawa, is intending to do with the Fisheries Act right
don't.
after the budget.
No, I don't. Do you?
They're going to put well, I just heard it on the news today, that they're going to remove the section that requires a proponent of a project to show that they're not going to damage the habitat of the
Yes,
fishery.
well, that would be consistent with just about everything else they've done.
That they are, what I heard today is they're going to do that just after the budget, so that all the media, et cetera, are focused on the budget. And they're going to pass this change to the fishery.
Well, I mean, that's how they deregulated, I mean, they're gutting all of the sciences, they've deregulated the monitors for climate change. I mean, that's very consistent, but I mean, they're certainly the least ecologically sensitive government we have had in 20 years. At least. It's dreadful beyond belief. But there's so much public apathy or else inability to know how to organize or resist. Or lack of knowledge. You know, people don't know, what does that mean?
Well, what it's going to do is it's going to make me or you or an Aboriginal organization prove that what is being proposed will damage.
Yes.
That's
yes.
exactly what they're doing.
But they'll need a forum to do that, and they'll need some kind of legislative space, and that will all be hard to come by. No, we need a change of government. I don't say that lightly, but I really do. I think it's just unbelievable. But, I mean, that's my view. You were going to say something?
Well, you touched on this briefly, and that was population growth of
Yes.
humans, which is another example of anthropocentrism. You know, we are the important points. Our religions are the important points. But when the human population goes up, species go down.
Yes.
And so we still talk about children as a blessing and all grandchildren and so on. I think we need to come to the realization that children are not such a gift as the Bible says, but they are a curse because of what we are. We're so smart that we can support these increased populations up to a point.
Up to a point, yes.
And you've talked about that. And the more we increase, the fewer species we have, and we depend on those species all the way down to the bottom of the ocean where you don't need oxygen to sustain life. That's a real concern, but we don't talk about it.
No, it's an anathema conversation.
Yeah, it's not
It is.
popular.
It's very difficult. I mean, we look at China and the one-child policy. So China brought in a very aggressive population policy, but then what they've done is that, I'm not going to get the numbers right, but the amount of missing girls, I think it's now, it's 56% girls and whatever the equivalent is of boys, and so now girls are being kidnapped all over China. So, I mean, it's just, anyway, it's very, very difficult topic. I agree with everything you said, but it's a very difficult topic to have. I mean, the Catholic Church is one of the few that keeps saying having more children, but even them out of the equation, it's still a difficult topic. Yes?
I'm interested in body awareness
Yes.
and the relationships we have with our bodies. And you mentioned gender and food and interiority. And I'm just wondering, kind of, those were connections that I pulled out relating to body. And where do you locate body in all of this?
Well, I think
our relationship with our bodies.
we're embodied creatures. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what, to me, we're embodied creatures. So we live not in a body, we are a body. And I think that the dichotomies of self and body and the hierarchical dualisms that most of us have trained in our mind, that spirit and matter aren't the same, and body and mind aren't the same, and feeling and thought are, I think that's all nonsense. I think we function in a much more integrative way. So I don't know if that is even close to your question, but... Do you have anything you add? You probably know more than I do.
I just wanted to hear you speak more, and that was wonderful.
Yeah, I don't think we use our bodies, we are our bodies. I mean, we just, and all creatures are embodied. So I'm not a fan of the spirit matter, that when we die our spirit goes off in some ethereal zone. I don't know even what that means. So to me, we are our bodies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I just wanted to say, I feel totally overwhelmed, I don't know if anybody else does. Have you got a book out that covers some of this, or?
Nope.
It'll take another lifetime, right?
It's taken me my lifetime to get this. No, I don't have a book on this. I mean, this is a collage of a lot of different writers and disciplines kind of framing issues in a certain way. Let me think about whether I can think of a book in particular, but there's hundreds of books out on worldview change, on ecological issues, but they're all different.
Good point about kids, children. Who said something about, are they a gift? If we could quit having to keep them, it kind of runs into the same issue there.
Thank you.
It's been said that, among other things, there will never be peace in the world until religions come together to make that happen. And I was thinking as I was listening to you, where would you start if you had a chance to sit down with the bishops in Canada and say, let's begin a program, or at least that's a starting point. You use about a reference point about where we begin to look at reality in a new way. Because in reality, there's no direction. I mean, I certainly haven't seen any direction. There are individuals who try to raise consciousness about issues related to ecology and justice and so on, but where would be, or could you envision a starting point?
A starting point for the Catholic hierarchy?
No, to invite us as a church, and certainly beyond the church, to begin to address the kinds of things that you're talking about tonight. We can't talk about everything, but beginning.
In my view, what we are most ignorant of is science. So science, not reductionist science, but I do think, so all the work that's been done, it's called big history. So there's a whole project to do big history. I don't like the term, it's a very American term, but there's all these university programs now starting. The whole education program starts with the Big Bang of the Big Bang of the universe and takes us to the present and say, you can't understand anything without understanding the whole context. So I think that, I think religions get caught up in being self-referencing, and they don't reference themselves to the larger realities, where in their earlier incarnations they did. I mean, Thomas Aquinas was an extraordinary scientist. But this whole split between religion and science has completely narrowed and truncated our religious worldview. So we compare ourselves to the beliefs and the dogma, which is actually Gnosticism, which is actually what the church said no to, but in fact it's now the actual form. So for me, I wouldn't start with the dogmas. Thomas Berry always had this very controversial line, put the Bible on the shelf for 300 years and could we get on with finding the spiritual roots to reality? And personally, I know people don't like it and they used to stamp their feet when he said it, but I think he's right. I think we should start with educating ourselves with a different view of reality. Now, science isn't neutral, but there's extraordinarily good science now that teaches us these dynamics. So any of the evolutionary theorists that are looking at holistic systems, or what they call emergent complexity, so they're not reductionist science. So it's not the God delusion guy. Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett, they're very good scientists, but their understanding of a mysterious or spiritual or depth, it's not there. So I wouldn't start with them, but there are other scientists like Ursula Goodenough and all the scientists in big history, they're extraordinary. And I mean, learn how to grow food. And Meister Eckhart said, if I spent an hour with a caterpillar, I would never have to hear another sermon. I mean, that's very, very enticing. So, I think that the relationship between spirituality and the earth is the strongest, oldest relationship in the human psyche, and we've lost it. So let's cultivate it, but I don't think the door in is through religion. which is why I said I'm not sure what's going to happen to religion. I just don't think that's the door in that will awaken us fast enough. I think it's the science spirituality door. I think that's much more promising, and it awakens something where you go, oh yeah, I knew that. I mean, awaken something that's within you. I mean, grow food.
Now there's not just the universe, there are multiple universes.
Well, that's a theory. The theory of multiple universes is a theory. The only one in the phenomenological order we know is this. I mean, we only know the boundaries of this. That's a mathematical concept. It's possible. But it's more, that's calculated on computers and probability, whereas the calculation of the numbers of galaxies is much more from the observable and from dark matter and dark energy. So the actual source of knowledge is different, and I go more with the phenomenology myself than with speculation myself. Here's a good book to read. It's called Wild Justice, The Moral Lives of Animals. And so this is just one door in, but if you want to realize how complex and interesting animals are, that they have moral lives and friendships and communities and decision-makings and ritual, and they're not at all insensitive, unrational, unemotional beings, that's a very good book. It's very simple, easy to read, by Mark Bekoff. You should read The Journey of the Universe. That's a book. You should see the film, The Journey of the Universe. These are simple doors in that awaken you to these larger dimensions. So there's really hundreds of resources. Even if you just, I'm sure all of you do computers, Google Big History, Google The Journey of the Universe, read, of course, Thomas Berry. Yes.
Did you run into the Pachamama?
Pachamama, sure. Pachamama is a very interesting group. It's much more earth-based, earth spirituality. That it's animism. Who brought up animism? So it's very similar to animism, the Pachamama, but it's a form of earth-based spiritualities, they're also very old in human traditions. Animism was very, very, probably the most profound form of spirituality, which was nature-based and earth-reverent. So these are older traditions than the ones based on revelations that are textually based and have dogmatic formulations around them. Anyway, that's kind of off the top of my head, but anything else? Oh,
Would you just repeat the first title that you mentioned, the first book that you meant, Wild something?
Wild Justice. Wild Justice, The Moral Lives of Animals by Mark Bekoff, B-E-K-O-F-F. He lived with wolves for a while, so he's very eccentric, but very interesting. He's an ethnographer. Do we need to close this down? Okay, last question, please.
I do want to thank you for quite an overwhelming talk and very inspiring. And at the risk of oversimplifying what I gleaned, and only some of it, of course, from what you said, for me, I'm going to go away thinking that rather than be boggled and think, what little can I do being a single person, I heard you to say that, right or wrong, interiority and changing who I am and growing my spirituality versus my addiction to my bodily wishes is the start, it's the spark to take me forward into a better perspective on my connection to the universe, to my community, and so I think that we as a Western civilization have been overindulgent.
Oh, yes.
On almost every facet of our existence, and so what you've spoken of tonight is to say that we are at a tipping point and need to completely do a 180 and start heading back. It's a little like that book, and I'm sorry I won't say it well, but it's about the caterpillar, the flower, something about the flowers, and he gets to the top of and he's turning into a butterfly. And so rather than fall off, leap off with the horde ahead of him that's falling off, he turns and says, I'm going back, and he goes back into his chrysalis and becomes the most beautiful butterfly. I'm sorry I can't name that title, but in any event, it's for me it's symbolic about how you have to turn away from the tide going in the wrong direction. So thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you. Just want a last comment of interiority is one aspect. But, not all of us can't be activists, and all of us won't be good activists. But there's many, many other things one can do. So attending to interiority is one. Joining a group is another. supporting a group is another. So the generation that has some kind of flexible income, you know, there's so many NGOs, and I mean, this university as well, that's got a whole sustainability program that's very interested in justice. I mean, I know you are donors here, but, you know, these programs and groups that do all of this alternative work are all broke. They all need funding. So, you know, attending to oneself is one thing. Joining and supporting a group is another. There's so many ways one can do something. So it's a wide open future for all of us in that regard. Thank you.
I'm Jim Frank. I'm the Vice President and Academic Dean at St. Jerome's University. I'm Dr. Perrin's right-hand person. I want to thank Dr. Eaton for a very thought-provoking talk. I'm always looking for that sort of kernel of a message that I can take away that can change my life. Things can look pretty depressing at times when we look at all the challenges we're facing, and in one way or another, we've all contributed to those challenges, either by being quiet or in some direct way. And the message I heard from you, the one that I really grabbed onto, was practice peace. And when I thought about practice peace, in the context in which you presented tonight, it starts with recognizing the rich resources that we have in this country, that we have personally, and the wealth we have personally, and the talents, and then sharing those resources. Because as soon as we start to share those resources, we are building communities. And in the words of your PhD students, we're building rhizome communities, because rhizome communities are tough, and they weather these difficulties and think their way through it. I don't know if rhizomes think, but in that sense, we think our way through it. And it's by that we can, just by those little ways of sharing, that we can build communities bring about change. With that, and along with what you said just moments ago, I want to thank our donors out here for sharing what you have available with our community here at St. Jerome's, because that makes a difference to our students. It sends them to places that really stretches their thinkings and opens their eyes, and hopefully down the road, when they're sitting where you are today, they're sharing back once again. So thank you, Dr. Eaton.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks, everybody, for coming and spending your evening with us. There are still some refreshments in the lobby, so please feel free to mill about for a little while and help yourself. If you would like to support this series, and thank you, Heather, for the plug for us, you will find donation forms in the lobby, so feel free to fill those out and place them in the basket. You can also sign up for the lecture series to get information about next year's lectures if you're not already on that mailing list, so email as well. Save some trees. The remaining lecture in this series is on Thursday, April the 19th. It's the John Sweeney lecture, which will be a panel discussion on patient safety. It is held at St. Mary's, so you do have to send an RSVP if you'd like to go. You can find that address on our website at sju.ca, but it's Foundation News at SMGH, which is St. Mary's General Hospital.ca. But again, you can come see me if you need to have that. So thanks again for coming. Thank you for supporting the lecture series this year, if I don't see you in April. And hope we see you out next year. Thanks so much.